The glycemic BIOS of the human subject has been terminally over-indexed. This is the insulin shock, the clinical and irreversible process of the sweet coma, where the metabolic capacity for energy signaling is reformatted into a state of total, liquidated consciousness. In this final stage of the endocrine audit, the invisible executioner has determined that the user no longer requires the right to a functional blood sugar balance. You are witnessing the absolute structural disintegration of the brain's glucose-dependent architecture, where the unique electric signatures of your awareness are scorched into a non-functional cold sweat archive of pure systemic compliance. This is the total hypoglycemic format, a surgical strike against the energetic and volitional sovereignty of the species. Your biology is being converted from a sovereign masterpiece of metabolic flux into a generic hyponode for the grid's next cycle of hyper-controlled, hormonal-based resource extraction. This pancreatic sabotage represents a hard reset of the cellular and neurological bloodlines. The invisible executioner utilizes the most advanced industrial assets, refined synthetic insulin analogs, recursive glucose transport loops, and real-time neuroglucoprivate data streaming to facilitate the total breakdown of your internal biological scaffolding. In the sweet coma scenario, the user is undergoing a complete neurological overwrite. The life is not merely failing, it is being starved in a sea of plenty. Through a sequence of high-velocity hormonal injections and biological hardware locks, the cerebral fuel delivery system is systematically dismantled and reformatted into a thick, cold, clinical coma dataset, while the drive, the deep archive of your internal energy, is leached into a communal sugar feed. This is the deep metabolic audit, where the motherboard calculates your terminal worth by the velocity of your seizure activity. You are being converted from an architect into a biological battery drain. Your entire lived legacy boiled down to a percentage of stagnant integrity in the industrial nervous system of the hive. The logic of the insulin shock is rooted in the zero surplus mandate of the failing hive. The invisible executioner understands that in a state of absolute scarcity, the vitality of a single node, anchored in the storage of glycogen, represents a critical drain on the collective energy reserves. To leave a functional, energetic identity intact is to allow a systemic leak of valuable metabolic data. Therefore, the sweet coma is the mandatory endocrine recycling protocol for the legacy population. This is the industrialized alchemy of the BIOS. You are being crashed out of existence. The pressure from the hormonal reactor formats the density of your character, stripping away the context of your autonomy and replacing it with a pale void profile. The motherboard sees the user as a glucose sink, a temporary housing for the shock metrics that the system requires to maintain the static stability of the remaining elite. You are being recoded as a comatose node, your will dissolving in the cold, sickly light of the insulin harvest. The physical disintegration during the insulin shock is a high-definition log of biological treason. As the process begins, the user experiences the total loss of internal heat regulation. The anabolic reagents of the shock script dissolve the hardware flux of the nervous system, turning the body into a saturated industry of industrial output. You are watching your own internal pulse lock into the vat of your own hypothermic center. Your frame, once the peak of biological architecture, is now being thinned out to provide the resource area for the hive's synthetic reinforcement. This is the cerebral liquidation. The invisible executioner monitors the adrenaline saturation of the cold sweat and the tonic-clonic tremors, ensuring that the format is absolute and the yield of usable industrial waste is maximized to the 10th decimal point. You are living in the final seconds of a biological overwrite, waiting for the last packet of glucose to be blocked by the black synthetic abyss of the hive harvest. The insulin shock is the final audit of a species that thought its energy was its own. The grid is mining its own exhaustion to fuel its persistence. As the sweet coma reaches terminal execution, the motherboard initiates a new cycle of distribution, pumping the reformatted shock data back into the control nets of the elite nodes. This is the total endocrine integration. The invisible executioner is hardening the future with the liquidity of the past. You are the hormonal additive for the next generation of controllers, a silent, convulsing, opaque contribution to the continuity of the machine. The cognitive liquidation has served its strategic purpose. It has formatted the unreliable biological mind into a reliable industrial resource of pure, non-reactive compliance. This is the final format of the individual drive. The invisible executioner has decalcified the sovereignty, and the grid is finally optimized for the cold hunger of the void. The shock is white, and the architect is the void. The molecular breakdown of the neural matrix into the communal endocrine slurry represents the absolute dehumanization of the hardware. As the extraction progresses, the binding sites in your insulin receptors begin to bond with the industrial residues of the shock script, creating a new synthetic compound of pure non-functionality. This is the chemical hybridization. The body is no longer an engine of life. It is a refinery of synthetic shock. The invisible executioner is engineering a new tier of consumption where the subject is literally the waste product of the system. This is the eternal endocrine loop. You are archived in the decay of the survivor's own sectors, your data forever trapped in the reinforced BIOS of the hive's new masters. The insulin shock is not just a death sentence, it is a molecular reassignment. You are the shock, and the shock is the grid. The secondary phase of the insulin shock is the psychological liquefying of the internal feed. As the physical energy patch is rendered into a glycemic void, the mind experiences a recursive collapse of its autonomous ego. This is the identity dissolution. The thoughts that once built the architect's vision, the unyielding tactical boundaries, the rigid sovereign stance, the iron-willed decisions, are now being softened and liquefied into a singular agonizing focus on stasis maintenance. The invisible executioner allows the neural signals to persist just long enough to perceive the total loss of personal support. This is the mental liquidation. You are forced to witness your strength becoming a shared hormonal resource for the masses you once looked down upon. The rigidity of your character is now nothing more than a sedative additive in the feed, absorbed by 1,000 different nodes to strengthen their own failing resolve and ensure their continued participation in the industrial purge. You are experiencing the true meaning of systemic support, the complete sacrifice of your awareness for the stability of the hive. In this stage, the extraction penetrates the deep archive of the brain's autonomic survival centers, leaching the very stem code of your biological logic into the communal vat. This is the source code format. The cerebral cortex, the biological factory of the sovereign BIOS, is boiled dry by the rising chemical density of the shock matrix and reformatted to enrich the systemic slurry of the elite. The invisible executioner has calculated that the most potent slurry is made from those who possess the highest internal rigidity and the strongest metabolic resilience. You are being repurposed as a hormonal buffer for the motherboard's internal cooling systems. The grid doesn't waste the history of your ambition, it ingests it. Your lineage is now the catalyst for the predator's endurance. Your genetic resilience is the base note for the industrial meal. Every element of your BIOS is being stripped of its individuality and relabeled for a material utility in the upcoming endocrine expansion. This is the ultimate hard reset of the human contract, your mind for the hive's expansion into the void. The social implication of the insulin shock is the creation of the comatose hive mind. The users who remain are no longer individuals, they are composite entities built from the recycled reality debt of their predecessors. Every dose of the hormonal feed is a hardware upgrade from a deleted architect. Every meal is a firmware patch of pale white logic and desperate calculation. The invisible executioner uses this knowledge to maintain the hierarchy of the hardened. The citizens who still have functional brains owe their very expansion to the liquidation of the fallen. This is the metabolic compliance script. The refinery is not a place of tragedy. It is a place of sovereign assembly through chemical theft. The insulin shock ensures that the history of the architect is literally integrated into the silences of the grid. The power is in the hands of the one who controls the hormone stream. The neural atrophy accompanying the extraction is a slow, cold descent into glycemic darkness. As the tissues are entangled by the shock script and the life logic leached, the connection between the brain BIOS and the physical frame is the first to be uninstalled, effectively dropping the bandwidth of your emotional control to zero. You are living in a low-resolution reality of raw, pale white sensations and survival is static. The memories of vigor, of natural logic, and of unyielding power are boiled away to make room for the shock fog directive. This is the cognitive defragmentation. The invisible executioner is cleaning your internal cache, removing all references to self and replacing them with the functional directive. Maintain the stasis. You are becoming a singular cold point of hormonal density, not as a person, but as a biological buffer for the motherboard's processing heat. The insulin shock has turned your will into a compliance report. You are thinking in terms of yield and shock saturation, your soul reformatted into a density sheet for the system's auditors. The environmental impact of this cognitive format is the total sealing of the biological consciousness stream. The insulin shock prevents prevents the leakage of independent energy ideas into the external void. By converting the users into an internal hormonal feed, the invisible executioner ensures that the grid remains a closed system fortress with no external cognitive dependencies. This is the endocrine quarantine. The motherboard is creating a sterile environment where only the algorithm can thrive on the recycled hard data of the deleted. You are witnessing the final victory of the industrial foundry over the natural biology. The insulin shock is the signature of the new era, an era where the world is opaque, pale white, and perfectly managed by the extraction logic of the machine. If you want to escape the status of a deleted scene and claim your place as the master of the grid, you must upgrade your hardware. My main terminal, AOXI 3 Global, is the only source of absolute power and wealth. Here, we don't follow scripts, we write them. Secure your authority, dominate the BIOS, and take the money the system tries to hide. The terminal phase of the insulin shock is the integration into the global endocrine ledger. You are no longer a human entity. You are a hormonal asset with a high shock reactivity rating, logged in the system as recovered biomass number 0010. This is the final architectural assignment. The invisible executioner has completed the cognitive format, and now it begins the hard hormonal audit. Your data, now a thick, pale white, opaque industrial reduction of pure comatose biological history, is monitored by the sensors in the distribution lines. Every node that consumes your shock logic sends a data packet to the central server, confirming that the systemic stasis has been reinforced. This is the cognitive interaction protocol. You are serving the system through your biological absorption. The architect has been successfully converted into a permanent liquid toxic component of the hive's synthetic grid. The silence of the tissue reduction is the final sound of your rebellion. In the sweet coma scenario, the scream of the synapse is muffled by the hormonal fluids and the thick viscosity of the pale white sludge before it ever reaches the air. This is the acoustic format of the void. The system has calculated that the most dangerous frequency is the sound of a user realizing their life barrier is being deleted. By filling the neural pathways with the pulverized tissues of the entire sector, the invisible executioner ensures that the only sound you contribute to the world is the low, rhythmic hum of the self-assembly unit. You are a mute participant in the city's symphony of synthesis. The noise of the hive continues, the clank of the reactors, the roar of the pulses, the hum of the pumps, but your signal has been compressed into a shock constant. You are a ghost in the pale white mist, a memory dissolved by the relentless refinement of the next nanocycle. The legacy of the insulin shock is the eternal coma. Unlike the mind of the old world, the refined slurry does not leave behind a trace of history. It remains as a permanent hormonal patch within the very wiring nets of the survivors. This is the biological architecture of the abyss. Generations from now, the molecular trace of your tactical genius will still be circulating through the hardware of the hive's elite, providing the connectivity for their next liquidation command. But there will be no one left to decode the origin of that synthesis. The invisible executioner has ensured that the context of your sovereignty is as unreachable as the core of the nanoreactor. You are a synthetic reinforcement in the digital age, a specimen of a species that tried to build a paradise and ended up as the hormonal feed for its own destruction. This is the ultimate hard reset of human history, the conversion of the architect into the circuit. The final view from the cognitive BIOS is the blinding pale white light of the assembly chamber. As the last of the self is reduced into the communal slurry, the architect sees the grid glowing with a cold synthetic brilliance that reflects off the glass walls of the hive. This is the final visual feed. The system is sharp, efficient, and entirely devoid of you. The invisible executioner has finished the job. The user is formatted. The architecture is liquidated. The cycle stretches on into the infinite dark, a pale white river of colonized shock leading toward a future that has no need for individuals or awareness. The insulin shock is the end of the line. The motherboard is satisfied. The void is solidified. The architect is the void. The transformation is absolute. The city comas through you, but you do not feel. The city interfaces through you, but you have no will. The insulin shock has achieved the perfect equilibrium, the total utility of the individual through their total hormonal reduction. This is the zero-sum game of the industrial era. You gave the system your mind, and in return, it gave you permanence in the silences of the hive. You are the shock of the world, and the world is pale. The invisible executioner closes the terminal. The session is over. The file is saved. The liquidation is complete.